I didn't build an ontology, but I wanted to, I guess, critique the method that we've been taught in this class with maybe a different version of this method of building ontology. Okay, so we need to start with Barry anytime we build an ontology. So what does he say? So in order to make a good ontology, you must first think. So we're going to have to do a little bit of thinking in this presentation. So this is my basic argument. So the realist approach to ontology has some flaws. Everyone can pretty much agree with that. The phantological approach, which I think Barry made up that term, for specific connotations, may have some benefits. And so if it does have benefits, then it should be applied, should be intermingled with the realist approach to make the best ontological method. Okay. So the one problem that I want to focus on is the problem of universals. I don't have time to talk about any other problems, so we'll talk about this one. So where are universals? So universals are supposed to exist in reality. This is the realist position. And so where are they? And so after class, I decided to ask Werner, where are these universals? So this is our conversation. If they really exist in reality, then where are they? Werner's reply, well, the universal is in you. I said, inside me? He said, no, in you. So what else do we talk about as being in you, but not inside of you? What other kind of thing?
Is this audience participation here?
Sure, a little bit. And
like a soul?
Oh, let's look at this guy. So the soul. We talk about the soul as being in you. And so if you go to definition 2a, the spiritual principle embodied in the human beings. Is it inside? No, it's in them. Okay. So what's the problem with this? First of all, souls don't exist. So that's kind of a problem. And thinking that they do exist, just as a heuristic, as a practical approach, leads to confusion. And so one example of this is how nice a gift for this, the ship of Theseus. Does anybody not know the story of the ship of Theseus? Does anyone not know? Okay, a couple people don't know. Okay. So this ship travels out onto a journey, and along the way it gets damaged, and so pieces of the ship get replaced. And so when it returns, is it really the same ship? And there are different versions of this, of how many pieces are replaced, and what you do with the pieces, whether you build a new whole ship. And so if you think that there's a soul, the ship has some kind of soul, you might think, well, it's a whole thing. You can't really take parts of it away. And you can, because it doesn't have this kind of soul. It just has parts. And so the aggregate of parts, we just call the ship of Theseus. And so you might have original parts, you might have new parts, but this doesn't lead to some kind of indivisible substance that is the soul that comprises the ship of Theseus. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about an alternative view of how to break things up in the world. So we need to go all the way back to ancient Greece to look at Democritus' view. And so what does he say? And I'll read it because I like it. It's a nice quote. So by convention, sweet is sweet, bitter is bitter, hot is hot, cold is cold, color is color, but in reality, there are atoms and the void. Okay, so what does he think is really existing in reality? There's three things. So there's atoms, the void, and there's convention. Those are the three kinds of things that exist in reality. So if you look at those kind of things in Buffo terms, what would we have? Well, we have the atoms are material entities, the void is maybe a singular immaterial entity, and the conventions are all different kinds of dependent entities in some way that Buffo doesn't specify exactly. Okay. So just to put the sentence in kind of a Buffo way, we'd say by convention, occurrence are occurrence, qualities are qualities, roles are roles, dispositions are dispositions. I could have went on here. But in reality, there are material entities and an immaterial entity. Okay. So what is this other view called? And so Barry called it phantology to make it look scary and not appealing and doesn't seem like it's in reality. And so this is from his slide from earlier in the class. And so the ontological view is that only particulars exist, and then you could say things about those particulars, which are attributes. And the attributes are the things that the particulars have in common. So if two things are red, they both have the property of being red, which is common to both of the individuals in a particular individuals or in a particular set of individuals. So the phantomological view, individuals exist, sets of individuals exist, and then the attributes or properties that you can say about those individuals, the dependent entities, those exist. Okay. So let's go all the way back to Aristotle, because that's where you start anytime you want to do anything philosophical, and look at how he broke things up. So this was his ontological view of the world, which Barry showed us earlier in the semester. And so if you look at it, he breaks it up into two different parts. We have the independent entities, and we have the dependent entities. A's are B's that's C. A's and B's are always independent entities. And the D is always some kind of dependent entity. And so the A is always a smaller subset of the B's. So you have B's, and then within the B's, certain B's have a certain property, C, and all those B's that have that property C, we call those A's. And so what would this look like if you broke it up a little bit differently? We have the set of all material entities, and they have existence. So we have a little nice X and Y axis here. And then you break them up into smaller groups. So we have all the set of bodies. There they are. Okay. A set of bodies are material, and then we have a set of living things are animate, and then we can go on and so on and so forth. But of course, this is only half. This is so we'd have to double everything here, and so to double everything, it would look like this. And so if we would get complicated, but this is kind of how the world's actually broken apart. So if we were to modify Buffalo a little bit, which is like heresy right now, so I'm probably going to get really just points off for that, suggesting that Buffalo should be modified. It would look like this. We would have entity, which are all the things that exist, and then we have the independent entities, which would be material entities and immaterial entity, and then we would have the dependent entities, which would be properties which are dependent on the independent entities, realizable, something like a disposition, or non-realizable property like a quality. And occurrence, I'll just leave that in there. I won't talk about occurrence. So how would this actually work? And would it make a difference? So let's look at the gene ontology for a second as an example. So this is a part of the gene ontology. This is actually a part of the cellular component. And so when you look at this, and I know many people aren't biologists, but when you look at this, you look at this and think, that's really well organized. That makes biology make a whole lot more sense to me. I read that and I said, wow, I really learned something from that. It's organized in a good way that makes sense, that cuts the world at its joints. It makes things simpler. Does anybody think that when they read this? One person, okay. There's always one detractor, right? Okay. So what does it kind of look like? It kind of looks like somebody just kind of thought in general and was like, oh, I don't know, ciliary part, plasmid part, organelle. They just kind of, whatever came to their head, they just put into the ontology. And that's not necessarily a great way to do things. And just to show you it's not a great way, we have this little E-card here. And if it's on an E-card, that maybe it makes sense. I won't read it out. I'll just let you read it. So maybe we should do a little bit thinking, as Barry suggests, and figure out how to organize an ontology in a slightly better way. So one thing we have to do is go back to Aristotle's ontology and start to add entities from the gene ontology and see what it looks like. So we have material entity, and then it has a certain property. Some material entities are made of carbon. Those will be organic materials. Some organic materials compose cells. there are cellular components, and we go so on, so on, and so on, and so on until we get to individuals at the bottom. So we're still following the same pattern. A's or B's at C. We're following independent entities are a subset of dependent entities with, or a subset of another independent entity with certain properties. But there are a couple problems or things that you should notice when you do things this way. One is that it makes it obvious to see what kind of dependent entity you're using. So when I did this, I used different kind of dependent entities. So made of carbon, that's something with its composition. Maybe that's like a quality. Composing cells, it's probably a disposition. Maybe it's not this, but it's something else. And then size, probably another quality. So we use different dependent entities to define things. We kind of have to be careful and watch those. Because it might not be the best way to switch back and forth between different dependent qualities. You might want to keep the same dependent quality all the way down. Another thing that's a little odd here is that there are all these categories that are defined in terms of not something else. And so I think that these would serve as a placeholder. That, you know, when we build an ontology, we really don't think that, okay, this is it. And we know that this thing exists. We're going to add it to the ontology, and anything else is just going to stay out. What we can do here is say, okay, look at all the things that are not made of carbon. We just call them all or inorganic material. But you could probably break that up into smaller groups, right? So if someone wanted to break that into smaller groups, we could say, well, there are material entities that are made out of metal. There are material entities that are made out of salts or ions. So that not made of carbon group would get smaller and smaller as you decided to break it up into smaller and smaller groups. And so I think that this kind of highlights kind of an oversight in the way that the realist ontology operates. And so just to give another example, yeah, so I'll give this example. So what is this? A water bottle. Okay. I would say no. This is not a water bottle. This is a piece of plastic. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, good. So this is a piece of plastic.
Oh, there's water inside it.
Ignore the water for right now. The water is not relevant. So you defined it in terms of its disposition, right? It can function as a water bottle. And functions are dispositions. So you just picked an arbitrary dependent entity and said, okay, we'll call this what it is based on its disposition. But we could pick something else. We could pick a role. We could define it in terms of what role it has. We could pick some other quality that it has and define it in terms of that quality. So maybe these are cylindrical plastic cylinders. That's what we call them. And so I don't think people, when they make the definition, they really don't pay attention to the dependent quality or the dependent entity that they're talking about. They just kind of pick one and say, oh, well, we call this a water bottle because that's just what it is. And it's really not. You have to look at what kind of independent entity it is and then how you're defining it in terms of some arbitrarily chosen dependent entity. So the same thing you could do with macromolecules. I have enough time here, right? I have a couple minutes. Okay. Yeah, so same thing you do with macromolecules. So macromolecules, if you wanted to define it more into smaller and smaller groups or sets, we've already chosen macromolecule based on its mass. We probably shouldn't choose that again. It would be kind of odd to say, well, there are large macromolecules and there are small macromolecules. We probably should have made that division earlier. So let's look at parts. So we could separate the macromolecules into monomers, the dimers, the trimers, oligomers, and polymers. These all have a certain number of parts. And so that would be another way of defining the macromolecules into smaller subsets. Okay, so I want to get to, and so this is just to illustrate that a macromolecule of the disposition catalyzed reaction we call an enzyme. So enzymes are macromolecules that have the disposition to catalyze reactions. And we so take this further again, and so you could say enzymes some enzymes have the disposition to phosphorylate tyrosines, and the ones that do we call tyrosine kinases. So tyrosine kinases or enzyme that has a disposition to phosphorylate tyrosines. Okay, so in this last part here, I'm going to ask who cares? People actually care about this ontology stuff? Well, we'll see. So while I was in my master's program, I had an advisor, Betty Eiper. And so she was one of the advisors, one of the PIs in the lab. And before I left, I asked her, do you use the gene ontology? And she said, oh, what, the Go terms? I don't use those. No, I don't use those. They're really complicated, and they don't help me. And so I don't know if you know this, but she's obviously much smarter than me. She has her PhD from Harvard. And so she doesn't see the utility in the gene ontology because it just doesn't help her. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. You see why it doesn't help her. So to take an example, we have a cytosolic proteasome complex. And it has a definition. It is a it's a part of the cell, and it is a proteasome complex found in the cytosol of a cell. Okay, cytosolic proteasome complex. Okay, that's pretty good definition, right? So at this point, Barry would say that's a great definition. We can move on. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so now we have this HS-IUV protease complex. And it's a type of cytosolic proteasome complex. And so they probably should have put that here, right, in the independent entity. That possesses ATP-dependent protease activity, and then a bunch of other stuff down here, which Barry would call commentary. This is all commentary. This is extra stuff. You don't really need this. And I would think that scientists, this is actually the part that scientists are interested in. Because there are a lot of things down here that we'd actually want to know. And there are a lot of things down here that aren't down here that I would also want to know. So when I look at this kind of protease complex, I want to know what gene produces it, what species is found in, what cell types is it found in. There's all this information that Barry would call commentary. And that's not part of the definition. It's kind of just extra. And I think that these are the things that scientists actually care about, and they need to be in the ontology if scientists are going to actually have any motivation to use them. So let's make some conclusion points here. So first, the assertion that universals exist is more harmful than helpful when attempting to build ontologies that accurately reflect reality. Ontologies should be based on the fundamental dichotomy between independent entities and dependent entities. Before ontologies will be used by scientists, they must be presented in a way that is easily accessible and immediately useful to scientists. And lastly, scientists care about more than just good definitions. Thank you. I have a couple minutes.
So I wouldn't know where to start.
Yes.
So I've got a couple questions.
Okay.
So I feel like what you take to be, I feel like what the brunt of your objections are that you have issues with dependent entities as opposed to universals. And so you might be losing way too much when you start saying jettison universals. Case in point. What's that? That thing in front of you they use as an example?
Plastic.
You can't say that.
Why not?
Plastic's a universal.
Piece of plastic. So it's a independent entity. It's a kind of atom.
That's not an atom.
So it's a set of atoms.
And really, you shouldn't even be talking about atoms. You should be talking about like quarks and what have you.
Yeah, sure.
Or whatever the most fundamental
We
particle
can
is.
pick one level and say, okay, at that point we want to define everything in sets of that.
Yeah, where's the sets? Yeah. So I mean, I guess the point comes in at what point do we lose all utility of our language? You talked about like how the gene ontology is not useful to certain people. If we have to start doing all of our ontologies in terms of how many quarks are in what variations, I doubt most non-physicists are going to be able to use that.